In this video, I'm going to be talking about debounce in JavaScript. So debounce is extremely important as it allows us to improve the user experience in a website. So to further explain you by what I mean by that, I am going to first go to my browser, and over here you can see I have a very simple setup. I just have an input of type text that's present over here. You can see in the index.html, I just have an input of type text. Now why I have added this input text over here is so that I could explain you what happens in general scenarios versus how debounce effectively improves our performance and the user experience as well. So consider I have this search input. So whenever I type over here, consider that there is a database somewhere, and whenever I type something in the search input, I want to query that database based on whatever I type in this search input, and based on whatever I type over here, we will be querying the database for each of those values, and depending upon that, we'll get a list of items returned from the database, after which we can use that data and perform some action. So consider if I type something like, let's name a movie Shrek. So what happens in general scenarios is that when I type the first letter S, we query the database once. Alright, we query the database once, and then this S goes into our API call. It does a check in the backend for all the movies that start with the name of S, and then accordingly the API returns us a list of items with all the movies starting with the name of S. Then when I again click on SH, then what happens is it again sends a query to the database with the query being SH this time, and all the movies with the name starting from SH gets returned. And then when I do R, all the movies starting from the name SHR get returned. Then for E, similarly, all the names of the movies starting from SHRE get returned. And when I do K, all the movies with the name SHREK get returned from the database. Now this is not a very good approach, because with each and every letter that I type over here, we keep sending requests to our backend. So with each and every letter that I type, we send so many requests to our backend. So this ultimately leads to putting a very heavy load on our website. So the user visiting our website, whenever they type something over here, new requests come up with each and every letter, and then all those requests have to be downloaded and then served to the user with the latest results. So this can not only put heavy load on the website, but it can also cause some UI problems, because with each and every letter changing, we are getting a different response with which we have to update the UI. So this could even break the UI in some cases. So this is where we use debouncing to optimize our API calls and optimize these type of scenarios so that we do not put heavy load on our server and we do not make so many requests, and everything just works smoothly. So what debouncing does is, debouncing performs the action only after the user stops typing and after the delay is over. So what happens here is, let's consider the delay to be 1 second. So what I mean by why we need to set this delay is, what debouncing helps us do is, whenever I write something in this input, once I type something, the debounce function will check if that delay is over or not, if the delay we set is over or not. If that delay we set is over, only then that function will take whatever value is present inside this and it will query the database by sending this value. But if before that delay is over, I type something, right, if before that delay of 1 second is over and I type something more, then the debounce function will make sure that it clears that timeout and it does not send multiple API calls, but it only sends that API call after I have stopped typing and the delay of 1 second is over. So what I mean by that is, if I write S here and I stop, then since the second is also over and I have stopped typing, so a call will be sent to the server. But if I did something like this, if I did SHREK, then in this case, since I kept typing and after each letter that I typed, I did not stop there and there. I kept typing and I did not stop for a second. So the only moment where I stopped was when I wrote this entire Shrek and then I stopped, and then after a second, debounce function makes sure that the user has stopped and 1 second is also over. So then it will end up calling the API. So as you can see over here, if we follow this approach, then it optimizes our way of calling the API or performing an action by a lot. Because now we are not only calling the API for each and every letter, but we are only calling the API or performing an action once the user has stopped typing and that delay of 1 second or whatever delay we set is over. Now don't worry if you did not understand this right now. I'm going to implement the entire function and I'm going to dry run it as well to help you understand better how this works. So I'm going to remove this first of all, and then I'm going to go to my code editor over here, and in this script.js file I'm going to write the function. So first of all, I just want to select this input that I have over here. So for that, I'll do nothing, but I'll just write const input equals to document dot query selector, and I'm going to select the input. This should be input. All right. Now after this, what I can do is in the input, I want to set an event listener, right? Because every time I type something, when something changes in the input, I want to make sure that gets updated. So input, and then I'll check for the event of input. So this will ensure that whenever the input is changing, this gets called. And then of course that takes an event, and I'll just make this an arrow function. And now within this arrow function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a function named updateDebounce. All right. Now in this updateDebounce function, I'm going to pass the value that we type into the search input. So I'm going to say e.target.value, should be value. All right. So now obviously to make this work, to make the debounce work, let's create this function. So for that, what I'm going to do is something like this. This function call that we have over here, this is going to be a variable. All right, I'm going to make this a variable named updateDebounce, and this is going to be equal to a function which we're going to name as debounce. All right. So this is going to be equal to a function named debounce, and this debounce function that we have over here will take a callback as an argument and a delay as the argument. All right, so this will be the first argument, which is the callback, and the second argument is going to be the delay that we want to specify. In this case, it's going to be 1 second, so I'm going to write this at 1000, just 1000 milliseconds. All right, so this debounce function takes two arguments. First is the callback, and second is the delay. So let's create this debounce function as well. So right over here, I'm going to write function debounce, and then I'm going to call this function. And remember, the debounce function takes two arguments, a callback and the timer, which is a delay. So I'm going to write callback, and over here I can say delay. All right, so up until now we can understand this. It's pretty simple and self-explanatory. Now of course we are passing a callback over here, right? So whenever we pass a callback in the function, we do that because somewhere within this function we are going to invoke this callback, right? So when I invoke this callback over here refers to this over here, right? This function that we have declared over here. So we need to make sure there is some logic present over here, right? There is something happening inside this function, so that when we invoke this callback, this function gets triggered, and whatever action we are performing within this function gets outputted, so that we can see the change that's happening. And of course, don't worry, you will understand this better as I keep implementing this. So what I'm going to do over here, you notice this callback is taking a text argument. So now it's taking the text argument because we want to console log the value that we are typing within this function. Now how are we going to do that? Now to help you understand how we're going to do that, first of all, I'm going to write something within this callback. All I'm going to do is I'm going to write console.log, and I'm going to console log the text. All right, pretty simple and self-explanatory. So now if you don't understand this better, how we are going to use this, I'm going to help you understand that pretty soon, so don't worry about that. So let's go to the debounce function. Now within the debounce function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize a timer. Let's name it timeout. All right, and after this timeout, what I'm going to say is I'm going to return, and I'm going to, within this parenthesis, I'm going to write .args, and then this is going to do something. This is going to be an arrow function. So why have I written args? This args does nothing, but whatever arguments I pass in over here to the updateDebounce, that will all get spread within this parenthesis that you see. So I will also console log this and show you later on, so don't worry about that. So after this return, all I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the timeout, and I'm going to write timeout over here because later on we are going to attach this timer to something. So we want to clear this timeout because if the user has typed something, like if I typed S and before 1 second ended I typed something else before that delay ended, then we want to make sure we clear that timeout. We keep clearing that timeout. So after this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write timeout equals to set timeout, and within this I'm going to just call that callback with all the arguments specified. And of course this timeout needs a delay, this timer needs a delay, so I'll just pass the delay that we have over here. Okay, so this is all we have to do for the debounce function. Now don't worry, I'll help you understand this function in a much better way by dry running it through properly. So before I explain you this properly, I'm going to go to my browser and check if we are actually getting the text outputted or not, like whatever value we input in the search, if we're getting that outputted or not. So if I go here and I type something A, B, all right, you can see we are getting this AB over here. And if I write C, something like that, then you can see we gradually get this entire value over here. But you will notice something cool. I'm going to refresh this. You will notice that I don't get the values directly. Like when I type ABC, I don't get the values right away. So for example, if I type ABC, you can see it's not console log, but it came up over here after a second. So if I write DE, it's gonna wait a second and then it got outputted over here. But in a general scenario, if I wrote ABCDE, it would directly just come up over here without waiting for a delay. So this is what debouncing does, and this is how it helps us optimize these calls. So what it does is, until I don't stop typing, it won't console log the output over here. It will only call the function, it will only trigger this function, this whole thing, only when I have stopped typing and the delay is over. So if you have the API being executed over here instead of just a console, then it would have only executed that API once we had stopped typing. You can see over here, if I write A and I stop a second, then that A gets console logged. If I write B and I stop a second, then after a second it comes up. But if I keep writing A, B, C, D, E, like if I backspace this and then I keep writing A, B, I'm just gonna empty this console, and if I write A, B, C, D, E, then it will only console log once, and it will give out the entire value at once after I stop typing and the delay got over. So this is how debouncing helps improve the performance and optimize our calls. So to help you understand this code better, let's start dry running this. So you can see over here on top that this updateDebounce is equal to this debounce function. So let's see what's happening inside this debounce function, because since this updateDebounce is equal to this debounce function, whatever this debounce function returns us will be equal to the updateDebounce, right? Because obviously this is a function, whatever this returns, that will finally be equal to updateDebounce. And therefore, when we call updateDebounce in the end over here, whatever updateDebounce is assigned to after this has been executed is what is going to be executed in the end. So if you didn't understand that, don't worry, I'll help you understand that now. So let's check out the debounce function. In the debounce function, it's taking two arguments. One is the callback and the second one is the delay, right? So let's go down to the debounce. We are sending the callback and the delay as the arguments. Now notice this debounce function is returning another function. This debounce function over here is returning this arrow function. So this means that whenever this debounce is invoked, it will return us this function, right? So this ultimately means that this updateDebounce variable is going to be equal to this arrow function, right? Pretty simple, because in this updateDebounce we are assigning it to another function call. So whatever this function call returns is going to be what updateDebounce stores, right? So this debounce over here returns this arrow function. So this means ultimately when we call updateDebounce will be assigned to this arrow function. So when we invoke updateDebounce, it is going to invoke this function over here, right? I hope you understood that. If you didn't, you can watch this part over and over again and you will get the idea. It's pretty simple. If you just map through the things, you will understand what I mean. So since updateDebounce is equal to whatever debounce function is returning, which is nothing but this, so ultimately when we call updateDebounce and when we pass an argument to this updateDebounce, this argument is obviously going to be mapped to this. So if I had like 5-6 arguments being passed over here, I have done this ... over here, because if I had multiple arguments passed over here, like 5 or 6 arguments, then all of those arguments would get spread over here. So we could use all of those arguments individually anywhere in this code. Instead of specifying each of those arguments over here one by one, we can just spread them out. And just to show you what I mean, I can also console log this out to you. So I'll just console log args. All right. So now you'll notice that when I type something in this in the search input, each of those values that's present, that's going to be equal to this args. Okay, now to show you what I mean, you see, if I write a, then that args takes this a. You see that if I write b, if I write v, I mean, then this args is av. So this args will always have whatever this is specified as. And this args, if we had multiple arguments over here, they are obviously all stored within an array. If I pass multiple arguments here and I do ... args, then this args individually refers to an array. It refers to an array of all those arguments. And that's why we spread those arguments, those array of arguments in the end, so that they can be individually passed within the parenthesis. So this just spreads all those arguments, all those elements within the array in this argument. So as you saw, when I console logged, I could get each of those values in this argument. Whatever I pass or whatever I write in the search input, that is nothing but the args. So this proves us that this updateDebounce is equal to this function over here. So whatever argument that I pass over here, that is going to pertain, that is going to refer to this args. And in this case, since there's only one argument, so whatever I write in that search input, when I pass it like this by doing ... args, that this args is going to refer to an array, and within this array is going to be present all the arguments, because it's an array. And when I spread all this out, it's just going to spread out all those arguments from the array, and we're going to get to access that over here. So that's why when I console log args, you're able to see the input value. So this ultimately proves that the updateDebounce is equal to this function over here. So this means whenever we type something and this updateDebounce gets called, it's calling this function, right? That is the important thing to remember over here. So when I start typing something, right, when I start typing something, what happens is we already have this timeout over here when this debounce was called the first time. So what happens now is whenever I type something, all right, whenever I type something for the first time, this debounce is going to be called. It's going to call this debounce, and then it's going to return us this function over here, which is going to be ultimately equal to the updateDebounce. So the next time whenever I type anything, only this part is going to be run, because this updateDebounce will already be equal to this function. So it will only keep calling this function. All right, so for example, I can show you this. If I console log something over here, if I console log, let's say out, let's say this is the outside part, you will see this out will only get console logged once, because as I keep typing, the first time when I type, this function gets assigned to this updateDebounce. So the next time it won't go through this part, it will only go through this part over here. So if I save this and I go to my console, and you will see if I start typing something, I just refresh this, you can see the out gets called the first time itself. That's because this updateDebounce is assigned to this debounce function, which is being called globally right over here itself. So in that case, the first time only out is logged, and then it returns this function over here. So this updateDebounce is already attached to this function. So now whenever I start typing, this updateDebounce is always going to refer to this function. I think I've given you a pretty in-depth explanation of how this code is working. So just to prove you this now, whenever I start typing in the search input, this out is not going to be console logged anymore. So you'll see if I write ABC, you see only those args and everything get console logged, but this out doesn't get console logged anymore. So this proves that this updateDebounce, when it passes the value, it's always equal to this over here. So what's happening here now is that I'm going to remove these console logs so that you don't get confused anymore. So when I start typing something, this timeout, which is globally there, obviously it gets passed down here because of closures, because of the scope and everything. So what happens now is, suppose I typed S. So what it does is, it first goes, it does a clear timeout of timeout. Of course, in the first time we do it, there is no timeout existing, but it will still run this clear timeout. All right, and then for that letter S, it will start a timer. It will start a timer with a delay of 1000 milliseconds. All right, so it will start a timer of 1000 milliseconds. Once that 1 second is over, it's going to call this callback. All right, so when I type S, it's going to clear whatever timeout that was there. Then it's going to assign this timeout to this set timeout over here. So upon typing S, a timer is going to be initiated with a delay of 1 second. All right, now if before that 1 second ends, I type something like H. All right, before that 1 second has ended, suppose I typed H. All right, so what's going to happen again is this updateDebounce is obviously going to run again because it detects for the input. So when I type on H, this is going to run again, which is going to make this run again. And when that happens, what's going to happen is, since this was global over here and this is not being run anywhere, so there is always one reference to this, right? So when I type H, it's going to clear whatever existing timeout that was there, right? So that previous existing timer of S, which was for 1 second, gets cleared out, right? So ultimately, if that gets cleared out, for S, whatever timeout was attached, whatever timer was attached, that gets cleared out completely. So it will never get to call the callback for that S itself. And that happens only when I type something before that 1 second ends. Alright, so if before 1 second ends and I type on H, it will just clear the existing timeout, which was for S previously, and then it will attach another timer for SH, and it will again give it a delay of 1 second. And this time, if I don't type anything after that, if I don't type anything after H, then after 1 second, once this delay is over, it is going to go within this, within the set timeout function, and it's going to execute whatever is there within this. It's going to execute whatever is present within this set timeout function. So then it's going to see that it's calling the callback with the arguments passed, and as you saw in the console log before, the arguments is nothing but an array with having all those values. So if you're spreading this, it's only going to spread out that value that was there. So if there's sh, it's going to spread out sh from that array. All right, it's going to send that sh from that array. So after 1 second, this callback is going to be called with the argument of sh. So now when this callback gets called, what was this callback? This callback was nothing but this part over here, the first argument. So when this callback gets called with an argument of sh, it's going to go and execute this. And when this part gets executed, it's going to obviously be having the argument as sh. So this will be sh. So, and then when we execute this, it's going to console log nothing but the text, which is sh. So ultimately we end up getting sh. So if you see over here, if I just refresh this and I write s and I write h before the second ends, you can see after a second delay, it shows sh. And that is nothing but the console log that was executed over here. So that is what debouncing does. Instead of repeatedly calling this function over and over again, it will only call it when we stop typing and that delay that we have specified is over. So that is how this optimizes the performance and makes things more efficient for us. Now, if you want to get a much better understanding of this, I can give you another example. What I'm going to do is, in this index.html, I'm going to write something over here. I'm going to say div, and right underneath the search input, I'm going to say the normal behavior, and right under the normal behavior, we can add something like a span, and that span is going to have an ID equals to, let's say, normal. And then we can, this should be normal. And then what we can do is we can copy this whole thing, and right underneath this, we can write debounced behavior or debounce behavior, and here we can set the ID as debounce. All right, so this is going to help you differentiate things in a much better manner. And now over here, I'm going to perform a few changes. So all I'm going to do over here is I'm going to select that normal text ID that we had, this part over here. I'm going to select this ID normal. So I can just write const normal text equals to document dot get element by ID, and I can pass in nothing but normal. All right, this was normal, right? Yes. And similarly, I can do the same thing for the debounced text. So that's going to be debounce text, and I'm going to select debounce. Now the only difference that's going to be there is whenever I start typing, before I explain you that, let me show you what's there in the UI. So there's this normal behavior and this debounce behavior. So whenever I start typing something in the normal behavior, this will continuously keep on getting filled, right? Like if I hit ABC, this should become ABC, but this will become ABC after a second. So that's what I want to show you so that you're able to understand this in a much better way. So when I type something, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write normal text dot text content equals to e dot target dot value. All right, and instead of this console log over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this But instead of the normal text, I'm going to say debounce text dot text content equals to the text. So this, I'm just going to save this over here like this, and I'm going to go to my browser. Now you'll see that in the normal behavior, things get populated as soon as I keep typing, but the debounce behavior, that's not going to be the case. So if I write something over here like shrek, you see this gets populated, but this took some time and it came back after a second. Now to show you this in a much better way, what I'm going to do is I can just add this colon over here, same over here. All right. I'm going to save this, I'm gonna go to the browser, and you see if I write sh, this comes quickly, but after a second this comes. And if I write rekkkkk, this will come after a second, but this came instantaneously. So that is what happens in debouncing. We won't keep on calling this function over and over again like the normal behavior is doing, like it's updating per key press, right? But in debounce behavior, it's going to only update or call that function only after we have stopped typing and that delay is over. So I hope you got to understand what I mean by debounce. Alright, so now lastly, one cool example of debouncing that you can see in a real life example is in the GitHub website. Alright, so I'm just going to zoom in a bit to this. So in the GitHub website, what you're going to see is right over here in the repository name, you're going to notice that whenever I type something, and after I'm done typing, it checks if that name is available or not, like if that name of the repository is available or not. So just notice, just keep your attention focused right here on this input and you'll see what happens. So let's say I write something like, I'll just write Shrek. I write Shrek. And you can see in the end, once I was done writing Shrek, it performed a loading type thing over here, and then it said Shrek is available. So this means that GitHub has also implemented some similar sort of debounce over here, because as you noticed, once I was done typing, this thing over here started loading and it showed us whether Shrek is available or not. So once we stopped typing and the timer, or basically the delay ended, it showed us whether Shrek is available or not. Of course, it takes a little lesser delay compared to what I showed in the example in our code. They might be taking something like 500 ms or something lesser than that as the delay, but the idea is pretty much the same. So just to show you one more time, just backspace this, and when I write Shrek, you see this loads and then it says Shrek is available. So it did not keep loading for each word as I kept on pressing. It did not load for S, it did not load for H, it did not load for R. It only loaded once I was done typing the entire thing. So this is very similar to what we implemented. This, I pretty much assume they have also used debouncing over here. So yeah, this is one live example of where debounce is being used in a pretty popular website named GitHub. So I hope this also cleared your idea about what debouncing actually is and where and how it can be used and what are its benefits. So yeah, this is all about the video. If you enjoyed the video, then don't forget to like and subscribe. And as usual, stay tuned for more.